They say fear makes men cruel, but for one boy, fear became an education. Wallachia, 1442, a child of a dragon, traded for peace, shackled in a foreign court. He watched mercy mocked, kindness punished, and learned the first law of survival. Pain creates fear. Fear creates obedience. Obedience creates power. Years later, that boy would return home not to rule, but to prove his equation. He would build a kingdom on terror and carve his name into history with sharpened stakes. This is the story of Vlad the Impaler, the architect of necessary evil. Before we continue, it would mean a lot to us if you could give us a quick like and subscribe by clicking on the bell icon. They called him Dracula, son of the dragon. But dragons burn their enemies. Vlad learned to make them suffer. In 1442, a boy and his brother were led away in chains, bargaining chips for a desperate father. The Ottoman court became their prison and their classroom. Vlad, 12, Radu, 7. Radu learned smiles, diplomacy, and charm. Vlad learned silence, observation, calculation. He watched as men died for amusement, as executions became performances, precise, rhythmic, efficient. He didn't flinch, he studied. He discovered a cruel equation that would define him. When his father and older brother were murdered, victims of mercy and misplaced trust, Vlad didn't cry. He smiled, because the equation worked. Mercy had killed them. Fear would not kill him. In those Ottoman shadows, a prince became a student of terror and a philosopher of control. When Vlad returned to Wallachia, he was no longer a son reclaiming his throne. He was a scientist testing a theory. He invited the nobles, the same boyars who had betrayed his father, to a grand Easter feast. Music, wine, laughter. Then, silence. The doors locked. By morning, the old nobles hung impaled outside the castle walls. The young marched to rebuild his fortress stone by stone, their parents rotting at the stakes above. It wasn't revenge, it was instruction. Vlad believed fear was more loyal than love, and he taught that lesson beautifully. He arranged executions like art, circles, spirals, crescents, visible from miles away. Each display a sermon, each corpse a paragraph. Foreign envoys whispered, "The Impaler doesn't kill, he composes." In the market square, he left a golden cup unguarded for years. No one dared touch it. When visitors praised the honesty of his people, Vlad corrected them. "They are not honest. They are afraid." It was the proudest thing he ever said. The world's greatest empire marched against him, 100,000 men under Sultan Mehmed II. Vlad had barely 10,000. To anyone else, it was suicide. To Vlad, it was theater. He burned his own villages, poisoned his wells, emptied his cities. When the Ottomans came, they found nothing but smoke, silence, and ghosts. Terror, he knew, was more contagious than courage. Then, one moonless night, he and his riders slipped into the Ottoman camp disguised as Turkish soldiers. They set fires, cut throats, vanished into blackness. By dawn, 15,000 were dead, and panic had done the killing. When the Sultan finally reached Targovishte, he stopped. Before him stretched a forest of corpses. 20,000 impaled prisoners, their bodies swaying in the wind like a ghastly choir. Even Mehmed, conqueror of Constantinople, refused to pass through it. The army turned back. Vlad had won without fighting. He'd turned psychology into artillery and horror into victory. The battle was over. The air still stank of pitch and death, yet Vlad felt only quiet, the kind of quiet that follows perfection. He had defeated an empire without a battle. He had proven that terror could outthink armies. And in that silence, something dangerous took root. He looked upon his work not with guilt, but with pride. To him, this wasn't horror, it was order. Each body a line in the scripture of fear, a message the world would never forget. But the silence grew heavy. No cheers, no songs, only the sound of the wind threading through corpses. And Vlad began to realize that fear could conquer others, but it could never fill the space it left behind. He turned inward, trading the sword for the quill. If the battlefield had crowned him a god, the pen would make him eternal. He began to craft his legend, writing to kings, bishops, and merchants, calling himself the defender of Christendom. He knew that words could do what armies could not: travel, multiply, endure. But each letter carried a hidden poison. The more he spoke of holiness, the more Europe whispered of hell. Vlad had won his war, but lost control of his story. Soon, the terror he built would no longer belong to him. It would belong to history. And history, as Vlad would learn, is the one empire no man can rule. As corpses rotted in the fields, Vlad wrote letters to kings and popes, painting himself as the defender of Christendom. He knew the power of perception. To the west, he was a holy warrior. To the east, the devil himself. And to Vlad, both roles were useful. He signed his letters Dracula, a name meaning both son of the dragon and son of the devil. When asked which he preferred, he smiled and said nothing, because both were true. Then came the pamphlets. Printers across Europe sold woodcuts of Vlad dining among the impaled, boiling men alive, laughing at their screams. He didn't deny the stories. He fed them. Because infamy, he understood, was immortality. He was no longer a ruler. He was a legend written in blood. The first man in history to weaponize fear as propaganda. And it worked. Even those who hated him couldn't stop speaking his name. Power built on fear has a hidden hunger. It must always be fed. And when no enemies remain, it begins to feed on its master. In the years after his victories, Vlad ruled over a land too quiet to trust. The nobles who survived learned obedience. The peasants worked without question. But obedience without affection breeds ghosts. And every night, those ghosts began to whisper. Vlad heard them in the silence of his hall, in the creak of wooden beams, in the rustle of servants too afraid to breathe near him. He mistook their terror for loyalty. But terror, once perfected, isolates the one who wields it. He wrote of divine missions, of a destiny forged by the hand of God, but the truth crept in like rot beneath armor. He wasn't building salvation. He was building a monument to himself, and even monuments crumble from within. The West saw him as a necessary evil, a wall against the Turk. But behind closed doors, the same kings who praised him spoke his name like a curse. He was too cruel for comfort, too famous to control. Allies turned to witnesses, witnesses turned to accusers. The architect of terror now stood inside his own design, surrounded by walls made of reputation and rumor. When the world fears you enough to bow, it also fears you enough to betray. And somewhere in that flickering darkness, Vlad began to sense it, that the very thing which had made him untouchable was now sealing his fate. But fear has a flaw. It commands obedience, not loyalty. His people, broken and hungry, opened their gates to his brother Radu, who returned at the head of a Turkish army. Not because they loved him, but because they were tired of being afraid. Vlad fled north to Hungary, seeking refuge from King Matthias Corvinus. Instead, he was imprisoned. The same letters that once made him look divine were now used to prove he was a monster. For 12 years he sat in a tower. Guards whispered that he impaled rats for practice, that even in captivity he couldn't stop perfecting fear. Released at last, he returned to Wallachia, and within weeks he was ambushed and killed. His head, preserved in honey, was sent to the Sultan. A fitting end for a man who turned death into spectacle. But Vlad would have smiled, because a clean death is forgotten. The mysterious one becomes legend. History calls him cruel. Psychology calls him brilliant. Truth calls him both. He wasn't a victim of his time. He was its architect. A man who mistook his gift for pain as proof of genius, who believed compassion was weakness, who built an empire on fear and called it order. Centuries later, his name would inspire a vampire, but the fiction was merciful compared to the man. Vampires need blood to live. Vlad needed only an audience. Some men want to be loved, others want to be feared. Vlad the Impaler wanted to be remembered, and in that he succeeded.